Hello, I'm Dr. Gotro, and we're here today with Dr. Chappell, and she has graciously given us her time and expertise today so we can talk on the topic of LGBTQ and gender diversity inclusion in PK to 12 schools. So thank you so much, Sharon. And if you would just, before you begin, like to share a little bit with us about your expertise and some of the goals you have for our presentation today. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. So thank you all for coming. I am a professor in elementary and bilingual education. I've been doing professional development on LGBTQ inclusion and gender diversity in K-12 schools for several years now. And I am trained as a Welcoming Schools Facilitator, which is a program out of the Human Rights Campaign. And it's a K-5 support program that focuses on family diversity, gender diversity, inclusive schools, frameworks for inclusive schools, supporting non-binary and transgender students, preventing bias-based bullying, and understanding law and policy that support LGBTQ inclusion in schools. So my goals, my goals are to address the unique concerns of LGBTQ youth with you briefly, share a brief glossary, and you'll see that this is going to feel quite like a whirlwind. I mean, we're just going to kind of go through a little bit of time for conversation, but hopefully more of a Q&A at the end. So it'll be, my style is not a traditionally a lecture format, but in terms of getting this information out to you, it'll be best for me to just kind of go through the slides and provide you with as much information as I can. So we're going to be looking at the relationship and differences between sex and gender, school laws that impact LGBTQ youth, how we create safe spaces, how we support transgender and non-binary youth in particular, and then resources that are available to you. There's a chat function that you can use to ask questions, and then I'll go back and scroll through these and answer them at the end. I see Jody's already asked about sex ed curriculum, and we do have a comprehensive sex education curriculum or requirement now in California. It was passed this past year, which requires LGBTQ content in sex education classes in 7th through 12th grade in California. So I do have some resources for you on that, and I can definitely share those at the end. So I want you to, what would be great is if you could put in the chat, if you have that available, or just to think about the pronouns that you use on a regular basis. And I want you to also think about what you hope to learn from the workshop and how this learning will help others. So if you have any goals for yourself for this workshop, if you could have put those in the chat function, and then I can look at those and kind of address those as I go. And in terms of pronouns, I just want us to think about how gender affects every aspect of our lives, where it comes up during a school day, whether you're in a kindergarten classroom, a 7th grade middle school classroom, or a college classroom or support services. I know Jody works in support services with queer students in college. Think about the ways gender intersects in our lives. We have pronouns that are used about us when people call on us in class. We have pronouns that get placed on forms. They're in the SPSS system. I think that's what it's called. I don't remember, the school attendance system. Pronouns get used there. And not always do our pronouns match the sex assigned at birth. So we're going to talk about how we can support our students as they are living their authentic selves and their authentic gender identities, regardless of whether it matches their sex assigned at birth. So we'll be talking about that as well. So first I wanted to say why we start off with LGBTQ inclusion and gender diversity in elementary school. And it's because 28% of LGBTQ youth drop out of school, which is more than 3 times the national average of any other identity community. Up to 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. In elementary schools, There's been a historic underserving of LGBTQ and gender topics in schools, as well as serving queer youth in elementary schools. We know with some lifespan studies of gay people that they remember early memories of identifying as gay as early as from age 4 all the way through elementary school. So we have students in our classrooms, whether we teach at the early elementary school level or into middle school, that know their sexual identity or are questioning their sexual identity. We also have students who know their gender identity doesn't match their sex assigned at birth, or they're questioning what their gender identity is and what pronouns they want to use. So prevention in elementary school is really important, particularly because it helps us to reduce later harassment. So in middle school, that's when sexual harassment, perceived sexual orientation harassment, and gender nonconformity or gender non-binary harassment really increases. And then it leads to later violence and rejection in adolescence. So it's very important that we start early with our prevention efforts, and we start to understand what kids are experiencing very early in elementary school, and then continue to have those conversations, continue to work from an inclusive place all the way through their schooling. So I want you to think about this, what it's like to grow up queer in America. We're going to be talking about terms, and LGBTQ and queer I'm using interchangeably here, and I'll talk to you about why when we get to the definitions of terms. So if you think about non-LGBT teens are predominantly concerned with grades, college plans, what college they're going to go to, how they're going to be able to afford it. LGBTQ youth are really worried about identity-based concerns. They're worried about their families not accepting who they are. They're worried about whether they'll be safe when they walk onto school campus. They're worried about where they're going to sit at lunch and if they're going to be ridiculed or targeted. So we want to think about how unsafe environments at schools, how non-inclusive environments that are built up around bias-based harassment and bullying impact student learning and achievement. And we want to think about how this directly affects our queer youth's focus on the future, whether they're able to even imagine themselves in college when they're really just trying to get through their day to day. So the power of acceptance is really important. LGBTQ youth are very resilient, and the most important element of resilience is the presence of supportive adults. So that means you, that means me. As mentors, as advocates and allies, we can be the single source of what gets queer youth through the day, and also as the single source of building that inclusive environment. So we want to think about what support looks like in a variety of spaces in our school campuses. We want to think about what it looks like in the classroom. Have our students evaluate what are safe and unsafe spaces at schools so we can learn where it is that they're not feeling safe, and we can specifically address those spaces and what kinds of language and actions are happening in those spaces. Oftentimes, youth identify the playground, places that are less supervised by adults. So the playground, the bus, the bathroom, places where there's a lot more peer interaction and less adult supervision. So we want to think about what inclusion looks like when we think about the power of that supportive adult, and we also think about how to build upstander capacities in our students so that they're not bystanders when they see something happening that is a bias-based bullying situation, when they hear derogatory names being called around perceived sexual orientation or non-conforming gender identity, non-binary gender identity. What do we do when we observe that, when we're onlookers, and we could be bystanders? What else can we do? So we want to not only be mentors ourselves and advocate and be visible in our advocacy, but we also want to support young people in building their own upstander and ally identities. So the LGBTQ acronym, there's a plus on the end because there are many aspects to this acronym, and I just wanted to talk about each one briefly. So what's really important is that historically in mainstream society, gender and sexuality has been conflated. So when you think about the way someone expresses their gender, if a person is less less conforming in their gender expression. So if I'm female and I behave more masculine, that has been associated with being gay or lesbian. If I'm a male or a boy and I present in gender expressive ways that are more feminine, I use my hands more, my voice goes up and down, I'm not interested in sports, that has been conflated with being a gay male. We know from research that that's not the case, that although gender and sexuality can be related, they're not necessarily related. So we're going to talk about those definitions in a minute. But just to get to the acronym, we have L for lesbian, gay, G for gay, B for bisexual, which would be attracted to both sexes, genders, and then the T would be transgender. So these are people whose gender identity does not match their sex assigned at birth. So a transgender man would be a man who was born with female genitalia but does not identify as female. A transgender man would identify as male. And then we also have the Q, and Q can function as queer or questioning. Queer is kind of a pan term that would involve any gender sexual identities that do not align with the mainstream heterosexual, presumed heterosexual identity. We also have an I and an A that is often attached, and these identities are very important within the LGBTQ category. Intersex people are people who are born with genitalia that is neither clearly male or female, and could be both, or there could be some genitalia that could be perceived as male or female. We also consider intersex to be all the way down to the hormonal and chromosomal levels as well. Intersex people have historically been operated on as babies, and a gender and the sex parts are assigned at birth, even though the baby had no choice about what sex or gender they are. And so the more current practice is to wait, and the doctor does not perform surgery and does not select a gender, and then the child and adult, when the child becomes an adult, gets to make those decisions for themselves about what gender they are, what sex they are. And many intersex people are very happy with their their sex characteristics and their genitalia as they are, without making a decision between one and the other. Asexual people are people who are not attracted to any gender or any sex. And so it's important that when we look at the LGBTQ category, some of the letters in the term relate to sexual orientation, and some of them relate to gender. So the T for transgender does not describe a sexual orientation. It describes a gender identity. So that is the kind of what the acronym is, and then we are going to go to specific terms. So I really like using the gender unicorn, because this was created by a group of trans students, and you can see the attribution of the URL here. It's a trans student organization, and they created this way of conceptualizing what the different terms mean. So gender is the idea that that society has assigned characteristics based on masculinity and femininity. Oftentimes, this is a gender binary that's been used socially. So if I were to say, what reminds you of being a boy, then you might say blue, sports, being assertive or aggressive, playing with dogs, being in the dirt, being loud. These are commonly socialized traits associated with being a boy. And then there are common associations with being a girl. Pink, being sweet, being kind, being less assertive, playing with dolls, playing with princesses. And so this gender binary creates a very rigid set of expectations for children and for young people, for all of us actually. And when we look at ourselves on a day-to-day basis, we may not fit into those binaries at all, or sometimes fit into them and sometimes not. And as adults, we have more capacity to move across the gender continuum. So we think about gender not as two binary categories, but rather as a continuum where we could be in one place at any moment in terms of our gender expression. So our gender identity, if you look at the first row on the gender unicorn, our gender identity is what we know inside our hearts and our minds what gender we are. So transgender people have a gender identity that does not match their sex assigned at birth, which was based on their physical sex characteristics. So gender expression, however, is the way we express ourselves outwardly to the world. So we may have a gender identity that is strongly one thing or another, or we might have a gender identity that's non-binary, in which I want to be called by the pronoun they because I don't see myself as one or the other. I don't see myself in my heart, in my mind, in my body as either male or female. I see myself as both or neither. Gender expression is how we put ourselves out into the world. I might express myself more femininely. I might express myself more masculinely. And then we have, I've already talked about sex assigned at birth. We also have who we're physically attracted to and who we're emotionally attracted to. So as you can see, this is a very complicated set of characteristics. And we're on a continuum for each of these. So I may be physically attracted to men and women or other genders. I may be emotionally attracted to only women. So it may be that I end up in a relationship with a woman because I'm physically and emotionally attracted to that person, or there may be another complex combination thereof. So I talked about being non-binary. I'm looking over here at this list. Gender fluid is another way of talking about moving between genders, not having a specific single gender identity. Being cisgender, this means that your gender identity and your gender expression and your sex assigned at birth are all aligned. Traditionally, so for example, I'm cisgender female. I was born with female body parts. I was assigned the gender identity of female at birth. And I generally express myself in feminine ways. So I have longer hair. I wear skirts and dresses. So I am what's called cisgender. And what happens with people who are cisgender is we often don't see the way we're allowed to move through the world in ways where nobody questions our gender, because I would be considered kind of the normative of what it means to be female. But if I were not cisgender, if I had my hair shaved, if I wore baggy clothes, for example, people might not know what to call me. Is she female? Is she not? Is she a lesbian? Is she bi? What's going on with her? I can't figure her out. I might get misgendered. People might say he when they see me from the back if I've got my hair shaved and I'm wearing baggy clothes. So being cisgender leverages a lot of privilege that we don't, as a cisgender woman, I don't perhaps always examine throughout my day. What happens in classrooms is that we make a lot of assumptions about our students and about characters in books and about relationships people have based on cisgender assumptions about people being heterosexual and people being aligned. Their gender identity is aligned with their expression, is aligned with their sex assigned at birth. And these assumptions are not always true, and in fact are definitely not always true. So let's just recap the differences between sex and gender before we get into what does this look like for schools. So sex is what's assigned at birth based on the genitalia. We presume a child's gender based on the sex assigned at birth, that someone born with a penis will be a boy and someone with a vulva will be a girl. However, the body and body parts of a person that a person's born with does not determine their gender. So that's really important. When I start describing with my daughter, who's 11, but even earlier on when we start talking about people who are transgender, I no longer say, a male or boy's underwear looks like this. I say a person with a penis would wear underwear that's shaped in a certain way. And what that does is it removes the assumption that having a penis means the person is male. And I explained to her what that means, that I'm talking about the body part, I'm not talking about the gender. So I've separated the two. So what does this all mean for schools? Well, schools have operated under very traditional gender binaries for a very long time. We've sorted in boy and girl lines. We've had boy and girl PE. We've grouped boy and girl when we have class competitions. We've had mother-son events and father-daughter dances. We talk about families, but we're really talking about straight families in school. And so there's been a lot of omission of what it means when you are a trans child, or when you're born or adopted into gay family. We have made a lot of omissions. We haven't studied queer history, the civil rights of LGBTQ people, their contributions to the world. And so recently we've had some school laws passed that are very, very helpful at both ensuring that LGBTQ people are visible in the curriculum, and also that LGBTQ children and staff and faculty are protected when they are at school. They're protected against discrimination, they're protected against violence and bullying. So I wanted to talk about a couple of laws with you. And those are the Fair Education Act and the new History Social Studies Framework. So the Fair Ed Act updates California's education guidelines to integrate age-appropriate factual information about the role and contributions of people with disabilities and LGBTQ people into history and social studies. This is very important because the Fair Ed Act has existed since 2012, but it hasn't been integrated into the curricular framework until 2016. So we're now at the point where we're demanding in California that textbooks include LGBTQ contributions and histories, shifting gender roles, looking at third gender, looking at the histories of LGBTQ struggles and contributions. So that's now going to be in the curriculum. We also have Seth's Law, which is AB 9, and it demands that the schools adopt a strong anti-bullying policy that creates specific processes for managing reports on bullying. And it happened because a 13-year-old Seth was a California student who committed suicide in 2010 after years of anti-gay bullying. And so this was signed into law in 2012. And what it does is it ensures that our bullying policies include enumerated things that are prohibited: intimidation, harassment, discrimination, and bullying, and that we prohibit this discrimination based on actual or perceived characteristics. So it's really important that that if a person is perceived as gay, even if they're not gay, if they're perceived as being gender non-binary, even though they don't see themselves as gender non-binary, if they're getting that harassment or bullying, then they are protected under this law. The other one that's most recent is AB 1266. It's the School Success and Opportunity Act. And what's really important about this, you may have heard of this as the bathroom law. It is a law that was passed specifically to protect transgender students at schools. And so what it says is that a student is permitted to participate in sex-segregated programs and activities, including athletics, and use facilities that are consistent with their gender identity, irrespective of the sex listed on the pupil's records. This is very important. Even if the student's records have not been changed, if they are transgender, I have my sex assigned at birth as male and I'm transgender female, I can and am protected to use the bathroom that aligns with my gender identity. It provides transgender students access to restrooms and locker rooms, and it requires that you cannot make that child who's transgender use the gender-neutral bathroom. It can be accessible to them, but they can't be required to use it because that would be discrimination. What comes up sometimes is, well, what do I do if parents are uncomfortable? There's a transgender child at the school. They don't want their child using the bathroom with this child. At that point, the principal or other school leadership would talk to the parent who's uncomfortable, not the transgender child's parents, but the parent who's uncomfortable, and say, I understand that you're uncomfortable. You may select the gender neutral, the other bathroom in the nurse's office for your child if that would make you feel better. But I cannot discriminate against any child at the school. They're using the bathroom that aligns with their gender identity. And so that's a very simple way of explaining how this AB 1266 bill works. Another thing that's really important about protecting transgender students is their right to privacy. So a student's transgender status, their legal name, their sex assigned at birth, these are all confidential, and they're covered under FERPA. So the school has an obligation to keep it private. They can't tell a parent who's concerned who the transgender child is. That would be against FERPA. They also should have a process to be able to determine a student's gender identity, such as allowing the student to talk to someone in administration or the teacher. And this is consistent and persistent gender identity expression, so that the child knows this is who they are. And what's really important is that you, as a teacher, we must protect the transgender child's privacy if parents don't know. So their right to privacy is protected, the child's right to privacy is protected before disclosure of information to the parent if they don't know. Because we have to think about, if the parent knowing will then create danger for the child in the home, then it's very important that the school maintains that right to privacy for the student. We also, under this right to privacy, require that students' records be changed when a student transitions at school. So the records on, my understanding is that there's a flip screen. The counselor has worked with many teachers in many districts around using the flip screen, so that what the teacher sees and what the substitute teachers see is the screen that is the child's name, their child's chosen name, their child's gender identity. And though that flip screen does not show the sex assigned at birth, it doesn't show their incorrect name. It only shows the transitioned child's correct information. And all of that is protected under the right to privacy. Okay, so now we're going to get to the nitty gritty and have a little bit of conversation. I'm going to talk to you briefly about three things. When we're doing LGBTQ and gender diversity inclusion in schools, we need to look at the structural aspects. So that's policies and practices happening at school, the environment of the school. We need to look at relationships, and we need to look at instruction. So we're going to look at slides on all three of those things. And then I'd like us to talk about some goals we have for what we can do around structural, relational, and instructional ways of being inclusive of LGBTQ youth and families. So structural things have to do with being aware of school laws. If you know that there are people on your school campus who don't know about anti-discrimination law, who don't know about the Fair Education Act, then one of the things we can do as advocates and allies is to raise awareness, to let them know what the laws are, bring in those resources, bring in someone from PFLAG, bring in someone from the LGBT Center OC if you're in Santa Ana, or another LGBT resource center wherever you are geographically. We need to make sure that the policies for bullying and non-discrimination are visible, they're accessible, and they're proactive. And they need to be LGBTQ inclusive. So if we say on campus, we're against bullying, but we don't say who we won't tolerate bullying about, and we don't enumerate race, ethnicity, national origin, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation. If we don't have those named, then that's not going to be comprehensive enough to ensure that our queer kids are protected. We want to make sure, too, that we update procedures and forms. So are they gender inclusive? Are they family diversity inclusive? For example, my daughter's school still has a field trip form that says, mother and father name. Well, what are you going to do when you have two mothers? It doesn't say parent one, parent two, parent/caregiver. It says mother, father. It also on a field trip form asks her gender. Well, is that even necessary to gather? Not really. I mean, going on a field trip, it doesn't matter what gender you are when you go on a field trip. So we could really update these forms to be more inclusive, more gender neutral when it's appropriate, and more family diversity inclusive as well. We also need to think about how to support students in transition. So if there's a student who comes to the teacher, the principal. The family comes to the teacher or the principal and says, my child is transitioning from male to female, and I need to know what our support plan is in place. I need to be prepared for this next school year or for next month or tomorrow, right? So we have what are called gender transition plans, and I'll show you a screenshot of that resource that you can use. It's called Schools in Transition, and it's a PDF that is available online, and it's fantastic at supporting all aspects of this, of what gender looks like in the school day and how to ensure that our transgender and non-binary students are safe. We also want to learn more about restorative practices. So we find out about how people can make it right when bias-based bullying happens, how we can attend to bias and really change practices in our schools. We can also think about becoming safe zone trained, posting LGBTQ inclusive signs and posters, sharing the lives and biography time of different LGBTQ leaders, and connecting with community resources and making those resources visible and accessible. So the structural piece is about policies, practices, and environment. Are they LGBTQ inclusive? Are they family diversity inclusive? Are they gender diversity inclusive? Now thinking about instructional tools and strategies. This has to do with curriculum and pedagogy. So we need to have visibility in our discussions and in our materials. We need to have LGBTQ history, literature, and identities in the curriculum. We need to have characters that kids read about, who are transgender, who are non-binary, who are gay, who are bisexual, who have two moms or two dads, who come from foster families. We need to have this diversity of representation. We need to help kids learn how to analyze gender stereotypes and talk about what happens when you're locked into a gender binary, how that hurts us in terms of our authenticity of expression. We need to look at popular culture and media. We need to help kids navigate the media that they see and how to talk about how gender stereotypes impact the way they see themselves and the way they see each other in their relationships. We need to promote school-wide activities. Those are instructional. We're teaching about what we value. We're teaching about who's visible and who matters in our school by having LGBTQ Spirit Day, Diversity Week, Harvey Milk Day, Day of Silence, Transgender Remembrance Day. We need to have those days happen at schools. They're very important. Identity weeks. And we need to use resources that are available to us. So I'm trained in Welcoming Schools. You can easily go on their website at welcomingschools.org. We have Gender Spectrum, which is a fantastic resource. We have Teaching Tolerance. Those three alone are going to get you through the day and how to become more LGBTQ inclusive and really connect with gender diversity and how to teach to gender diversity and gender inclusion in your classrooms. I've shown here a beautiful array of children's books. So thinking about representation across what literature is read, what nonfiction is read, that really can make those connections to LGBTQ inclusion. And then finally, relational tools and strategies. And these have to do with the way that we interact with each other as staff at schools and the way we demand that kids interact with each other around gender and sexuality. So first know that the terms are fluid. Kids are going to learn new terms from each other. We want to help them reflect on where they heard those terms. Like sometimes if a child's saying that's so gay, they may not know where that word came from. And so if we just ask them, what do you know about that word? And, you know, it's okay to be gay. And sometimes people use it in a negative way, but it's not really a negative thing. It's not a negative thing at all. So, you know, this is very important to have these kind of inquiry-based conversations. We also need to teach our students about words and phrases that are most accurate and respectful when we're talking about queer people, queer youth, and queer communities. We want to teach upstanding skills. One of my very favorite lessons in Welcoming Schools is about ally versus bystander and helping to build those ally skills in students. We need to teach students about bias, where it comes from, why it's been used for power and privilege, and become bias detectives so they can look around and they can see where bias is happening in their worlds. My daughter takes photos. When she sees women being objectified in advertisements that are posted in the airport, she's taking a photo. When she sees that that they isn't being used as a singular pronoun in her grammar program, she takes a photo of it. She's like, Mom, look what I found. She's looking for teen ally and activist role models. And she's saying, Mom, look who I found. I found this Indigenous teen activist. I found a queer youth activist who's working on promoting, protection for queer youth in her schools. She's looking for those things. We can teach our kids to become detectives so they too can feel empowered by what they see. Finally, we can use gender inclusive language. So instead of saying, hey, you guys, we can use friends and scholars. Guys isn't gender neutral. So we want to use those terms that encompass everyone. And we want to not organize kids by gender or sex. We can organize kids by number, birthday, who's feeling awesome, who's feeling fantastic. Lots of creative ways that don't relate to gender. And then we don't want to assign materials, books, jobs, manipulatives based on gender or sex. Books are for everyone. Colors are for everyone. Jobs are for everyone. Books are for everyone. All of our materials are for everyone. And this really helps kids see that, no, pink isn't just a girl's color. Pink is an everyone color. And those American Girl books, those are for everyone. And those Hardy Boy books, those are for everyone too. And so it really becomes a way for everyone to have an entry point because we're teaching that relationship. We're teaching respect. We're teaching, we're really encouraging kids to see each other for their authentic selves and their authentic interests and identities. So this is just a cute little cartoon. Sorry, teacher, but where do the kids go whose most salient identity isn't gender, but it's awesome? So that was like, you could line up by awesome, fantastic, and wonderful. Everybody pick one. And this is, I'm just getting to the last part before we do our Q&A. I'm just going to show you a few resources. So this is that Schools in Transition guide that I talked about. If you look this up online, it was created by the ACLU, Gender Spectrum, and the Human Rights Campaign, among other partners. And it provides comprehensive support in how to help transgender students feel included, to be included in K-12 schools. So just a recap about supporting transgender students, we need to respect their privacy, but don't assume that everyone knows a student is transgender, and don't out that student as well when discussing LGBTQ issues in the classroom. We want to accept students' identities as we describe them, but we don't want to assume based on appearance or sexual orientation, or we don't want to assume that students are going through phases. They are who they are today, and that's what we honor. We want to respect and use preferred names and pronouns. We don't want to use language that invalidates someone's gender identity. If they say what their gender pronoun is and we ignore it and use the other one, that invalidates. And so we really want to use that preferred, their name, their authentic pronoun. We want to continue to educate ourselves, self-reflect. We don't want to go to one queer person and find out everything from them and make them tell all of their story and then now you know everything about being queer. Instead, we want to keep educating ourselves every day, read everything we can, watch videos, seek out information, seek out lessons. It's a really exciting thing as a lifelong learner, and I think most of us as educators really feel like that. We have that lifelong learning identity. So I've talked about that. So here we are we think we have about 20 minutes, and I want to make sure that that we get to your questions and that we get to some of the things you put in the chat. So Jody here says, how do I advocate for LGBTQ